Week 4 of the fantasy football season, and here's the top 12 defenses I ranked heading into Week 4. The first defense of the week's the Buffalo Bills. So the Bills so far this season, their defense has been good and their offense has been even better for the 2-1 Bills. But the last couple weeks here, this defense has been big for fantasy football owners. Week 2 in Miami, 6 sacks, an interception, 2 fumble recoveries, and no points allowed with the shutout. And Week 3 versus Washington, 21 points, 2 sacks and a fumble recovery. In Week 4, they got a great matchup versus the Houston Texans. We're going to have a lot of trouble, in my opinion, moving the football here versus this Bill defense, especially in Buffalo, where this defense gets that extra energy from the crowd here. And it's going to be a long day for David Mills in this Texan offense. And it wouldn't surprise me to see the Bills in this one score a touchdown and have anywhere from 15 to 20 fantasy points. The second defense is the Tennessee Titans. So the Titans this season, they haven't been a fantasy defense to use, but the next 2 weeks here coming up, they got great matchups. This week versus the New York Jets, and then at the Jacksonville Jaguars. But right here, they versus the New York Jets, and they give up the most fantasy points to defense and special teams this season. Zach Wilson, he's been under a lot of pressure. He's been getting sacked a ton, and he's been throwing a lot of interceptions. So right here, I think the Tennessee Titans go into New York, and they make more trouble for Zach Wilson in this offense, where they get to him early and often, get a few interceptions, and could possibly find the end zone. So the Titans in this one, I think, reach double digits, or even way up there, 20 to 25 fantasy points as a peak in this one. The next defense is the Cincinnati Bengals at number 3. So the Bengals last week played a great defensive game versus that Pittsburgh Steelers offense, and now they got a great matchup versus the Jacksonville Jaguars tonight on Thursday Night Football. So right here, the Jacksonville Jaguars give up the 5th most fantasy points to defenses as special teams. And so far, the Cincinnati Bengals, they've played pretty good defense and special teams, including the Week 3 of Pittsburgh. Only 10 points allowed, 4 sacks and 2 interceptions. And Trevor Lawrence so far in his young career, in the first 3 games, he's got 2 or more turnovers. So I think Cincinnati, they'll get the 2 or 3 turnovers in this game, get 3 or 4 sacks possibly. And also, I think they could find the end zone as well in this game. So I like the Cincinnati Bengals at number 3. Number 4, the New Orleans Saints. So the Saints, the first 2 out of 3 games, they played well on defense and special teams. And they were a recommended pickup this week here with a good matchup versus the New York Giants. And the Saints are going to be the home team. Obviously, they're not going to be home in New Orleans while the field's still getting fixed up in the dome over there. But right here, Week 3 at New England, 13 points allowed, 2 sacks, 3 intos, including a pick 6 and a block kick. And right here, this Giant offensive line's in shambles. Saquon Barkley, he don't look 100% either. And Daniel Jones, we know throughout his young career so far, he's been a turnover machine. So I think the Saints are good for a few turnovers, good for a few sacks, and maybe a few 4th down stops if you play that in your league as well. The 5th defense is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So the Bucs had a bad ball game last week versus the high-powered Ram offense. But right here, this week, they go to New England. And you know this defense, they're going to want to play hard for Tom Brady and help him get the win versus Bill Belichick and stick it to him in this ball game. So right here, the Buccaneers had a big game in Week 2 versus the Atlanta Falcons. 25 points allowed, a sack, 3 interceptions, and 2 pick 6s in that ball game. And it wouldn't surprise me to see them in this game get to Mac Jones, get a few turnovers, and find the end zone once or maybe even twice like they did in Week 2 versus Atlanta. So the Bucs this week, they get things going, they get it all back together. They win this ball game and have a dominance of performance, in my opinion. The 6th defense is the Chicago Bears. So the Bears so far this season, with Khalil Mack leading the defense, obviously, they've been pretty decent for fantasy owners. Week 2 and 3, they had good fantasy days. Week 2 versus Cincinnati, 17 points allowed, 5 sacks, 3 interceptions, a fumble recovery, and a touchdown to the house in that one on a pick 6 on Burrow. And in Week 3 at the Cleveland Browns, 26 points allowed, but still had 5 sacks in that ball game. And now in Week 4, they got a great matchup versus the Detroit Lions, who have a bad offensive line, and who have Jared Goff, who's a decent quarterback behind center, but he's also a guy that's prone to turnovers. And the Bears, they were a recommended add on the waiver wire this week, and right now they're still available about in 65% of fantasy leagues. So right here, the Chicago Bears special team defense, I think they can make a few plays here versus Jared Goff and the Lions. And right here, I could see a good fantasy day with high double-digit fantasy day if they really get going in this one. The next defense, number 7, the Los Angeles Rams. So the Rams, they've been dominant so far the first 3 weeks of the season. And this defense, we know they got possibly the best 2 position players at corner with Jalen Ramsey and pass rusher in Aaron Donald. So right here, so far this season, pretty decent fantasy days. Week 3 versus a good Buck offense, 24 points allowed and 3 sacks. But here, week 4 versus the Arizona Cardinals, a team obviously they're familiar with in the same division in the AFC West here. I think they could get Kyler Murray down a few times. I think they're going to force him into some turnovers. And let's be real, we see a lot of times Kyler Murray, he throws that ball up for grabs, those 50-50 balls to try to make a spectacular play. But this is a defense that Murray shouldn't really try some of these risky plays, because this defense is going to come down with it and they're going to make plays. So in this game, it's going to be a shootout, I think, but I still think the Rams make a few plays and possibly find the end zone as well in this one. The next defense, number 8, the Washington football team. So yes, I recommended to drop the football team this week, but this week I still like the matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons, who pretty much hasn't got anything going this season on the offensive end of things. But the Washington football team, they've been a big bust so far, and they were one of the first defenses taken off the board in fantasy drafts this season. So this year, 10 points in week 1 versus the Chargers, week 2 at the Giants, 8 points, and week 3 at Buffalo, 43 points allowed. So they had negative 2 points in that ball game. So right here, week 4, it's a good matchup, like I mentioned, in Atlanta. They give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. And Matt Ryan, he's just not the same in my opinion, with Julio Jones gone, obviously, and traded to the Tennessee Titans in the offseason. But right now, I think in this game, Washington, they could generate some pass rush. They can maybe get a few turnovers, 3 or 4 sacks in this game. And I think this week is a 1-week only defense till you drop them again. I think they could be a top 8 defense this week. Number 9, the Miami Dolphins. So the Dolphins, they got a good matchup versus the Indianapolis Colts this week. And the ball game is in Miami as well. So the Dolphins last week lost a tough one versus the Vegas Raiders. But they did have a pick 6 in that ball game. 3 sacks and 29 points allowed. So right here in week 4 versus Indianapolis, I think they could get to Carson Wentz early and often, force a few turnovers, have a couple sacks maybe. And I know this defense isn't the greatest, but as a 1-week fill-in here, I think they definitely could be a top 10 defense. And they're still available in 80% of fantasy leagues. Number 10, the Indianapolis Colts. So right here, I could see this be a low-scoring type of game, or where both defenses make a few plays in this game and have good fantasy days. So the Colts, they're available right now. 59% of fantasy leagues is their DST. And the last 2 weeks, they've been pretty decent. Week 2 versus the Rams, 27 points allowed. Sack into a fumble recovery and a touchdown. And in week 3 at Tennessee, they still had a decent game. 25 points allowed, sacked, 2 interceptions, and a fumble recovery. So right here, week 4 at Miami, Jacoby Brissett is going to start once again at quarterback. And he didn't look totally horrible, in my opinion, versus the Vegas Raiders. But I think versus his former team that practiced a lot against them the last few seasons before they traded him to Miami, knows his tendencies, know what he's going to want to do. And I think that's going to give the Colts defense an advantage. And they're going to make a few plays in this game and reach double digits once again, in my opinion. Number 11, the Green Bay Packers. So the Packers, their defense this season so far hasn't been the greatest of defenses, but they've made some plays for fantasy owners. Week 2 versus Detroit, 17 points allowed, a sack, an interception, and a fumble recovery. In week 3 at San Francisco, 28 points allowed, 4 sacks, an into, and a fumble recovery. So right here, week 4, I think they could have a similar type of line to like they did in week 3 at San Francisco. 3 or 4 sacks, maybe an interception or 2, or a fumble recovery. And let's be real, this Pittsburgh Steelers offense just hasn't looked good the first 3 weeks of the season. And Deontay Johnson, we'll see if he plays in this game, because week 3, it was a big loss for the Steelers offense, and they only scored 10 points versus the Bengals. So right here, if he's going to be out in this game, this Green Bay defense is going to feast, in my opinion, because Juju Smith-Schuster just isn't the same anymore like he was a few years ago. And so far out of the gate, Chase Claypool has been off to a little bit of a slow start in my opinion. So I think this Packer defense can make a few plays in this showdown versus Pittsburgh and have a decent fantasy day. And the final defense I'm ranking this week's the Baltimore Ravens at the Denver Broncos. So the Ravens so far, they haven't been really good at all on defense and special teams for fantasy owners, but they're still owned in 84% of fantasy leagues. So the Ravens last week in a plus matchup at Detroit, they just didn't do much. I know they only gave up 17 points, but only had 2 sacks in the game and no turnovers and nothing. But right here, they go into Denver, 3-0 is Denver, but they verse weak teams, the Jets, Giants, and Jacksonville, they beat up on. So right here, I think Baltimore, they're going to want to get off to a quick start after almost blowing and losing last week's game. And I don't think Teddy Bridgewater is the greatest of quarterbacks. He's definitely a quarterback. If you're going to get some pressure on him, he's going to make mistakes, and it's going to be his toughest test to date this season for Bridgewater in this offense. So I think the Ravens in this one, they could be a sneaky defense and finish in the top 12 with a few interceptions, only holding this Bronco team to maybe 17 or 20 points as well in this one. And I like them at 12, so that's the top 12 defenses I'm ranking heading into week 4 of the fantasy football season.